can start. People are still coming in, but I don't want to waste any time here. So on behalf of Massachusetts Peace Action, oh, I'm sorry, Cole, do you want to, have you started the record button on it?
I have, yes.
Okay, thank you. So back to this, on behalf of Massachusetts Peace Action and especially our Peace in Ukraine campaign, I want to welcome all of you to this important educational forum this evening. It could not be more timely given the dramatic events taking place this week in Ukraine, in Russia, and in the United States. President Zelensky at the United Nations yesterday and is meeting today with President Biden and Vice President Harris, seeking deeper NATO involvement in the war. Russia updating its posture on the use of nuclear weapons. Significant Russian gains on the Ukraine battlefield, while Ukrainian troops are fighting inside Russia. Continuing claims by Western leaders that Ukraine is just the first step toward further Russian conquest of Europe, and how that perspective plays out in terms of the issue of how the war can end. To help us navigate these dangerous and complex events, we are fortunate tonight to have George Beebe. George is the Director of Grand Strategy of the Grand Strategy Program at the Quincy Institute, and he is a former intelligence analyst at the CIA's Russia Analysis Office. George has spoken regularly and written many articles and reports about the Ukraine war. Specifically, I would call your attention to his paper, Right-Sizing the Russian Threat to Europe, written with Anatol Lieven and Mark Episkopos, and his recent September 13 piece, Not Enough Long-Range Missiles to Make a Difference for Ukraine, but letting Kiev strike deep into Russia could lead us right into war. George, thank you so much for joining us this evening. We look forward to your reflections and analysis of some of the realities of the Ukraine war and the way that the war is being framed in the West. Perhaps starting with the points you have made about the need to right-size the Russian threat to Europe.
Great. Thank you very much, Paul, for that introduction. Thanks for the invitation to speak with you tonight. One important part of my biography that you didn't address is that I'm a New Englander. I was born in Connecticut, but spent much of my childhood in Littleton, Massachusetts. My mom's from Worcester. So I have a very warm place in my heart for Massachusetts. So I'm particularly happy to be able to talk to you all tonight. And Paul, I'm glad you phrased it the way you did in that introduction, talking about how this war is being framed, because that framing is a critical aspect of the problem that we're facing in Ukraine. And it's a critical part of trying to find a solution to the situation that we're facing. And to a great degree, there's been a battle over how to frame this war. At the risk of oversimplification, I'll offer two different frames that are competing. The dominant frame is that this is essentially a World War II problem. This is the problem of an autocratic dictator who has decided that he wants more land, that there is land outside the borders of his country that is rightfully belonging to him and to his people, and he's going to get it by military conquest. And the only way you can deal with that is through military force to deny him his objectives. And when faced with sufficient force, when faced with sufficient coercion, the aggressor says, it's just not worth it. The costs are much greater than the benefits. So I'm going to basically rein in my ambitions here. And, that's how you solve this problem. Political scientists have a term for this. They call it the deterrence model. And there are certainly lots of examples in history that fit that particular model. World War II and Nazi Germany sort of being the prototypical examples of that. And right now, that's the dominant framing that we've had ever since this invasion began 2.5 years ago. And one of the things that you'll notice if you go back and look at media coverage of the invasion and the war is it seems almost imperative for people writing about this to include the adjective unprovoked in front of invasion. This is an unprovoked invasion. It's the result of Putin's territorial ambitions. And much like Nazi Germany, this framing argues that if you don't stop Putin in Ukraine, he will just continue pushing, like Hitler did in World War II. You don't stop him in Poland, he moves on, right? So the other framing on this is saying, well, no, what we've really got here is more of a World War I kind of problem, one where alliances entangle countries and suspicions about armament programs in neighboring countries actually fuel fear and prompt countries to prepare their own militaries against what they think is looming aggression from a neighbor. And you get into a spiral problem, a cycle of action and reaction in which steps that each country thinks are essentially defensive get perceived by neighbors as preparations for aggression. And you wind up in a war that none of the states involved actually want or expect, but nonetheless can prove quite catastrophic. And World War I is the prototypical example of that problem. And I think that what we're dealing with Russia and Ukraine, although it's not purely one frame or the other, there are certainly aspects of territorial ambition and aggression that the Russians have exhibited in all of this. There are also very important aspects of a spiral model, a cycle of action and reaction in which each side's fears about threats to their security fuel military steps that have brought us greater and greater instability rather than deterrence, as the World War II model would argue. So the report that I've written on right-sizing the Russian threat to Europe, the big picture, the framing for that is, first and foremost, you need to recognize the kind of problem you're dealing with in Ukraine. Because the prescriptions for solving the problem that you have vary considerably depending on what kind of problem you're dealing with. If you're dealing with a World War I problem, then more deterrence, more military activity, building up your force capabilities, make that problem worse. They feed perceptions of insecurity by the other side. They trigger a cycle of action and reaction that doesn't solve your problem, it worsens your problem. And by the same token, if you're dealing with a World War II style problem, naked territorial ambition and aggression, then the kinds of things that you do to solve a World War I problem actually make it worse. So the appeasement problem, right? Let's try to find a compromise solution. Works well in a World War I style problem. It works poorly with a World War II style problem because it does, in fact, fuel perceptions on the part of the aggressor that you are weak, that you won't resist, and invites more aggression rather than deterring it. Now, I would argue that what we've done with Russia in this particular instance is we've misdiagnosed our problem. We've treated what is mostly a World War I style spiral model problem as if it's a deterrence problem. And if you see what the Biden administration did, both in the run-up to the invasion and in the immediate aftermath, we quite explicitly said, we're going to punish the Russians. We're going to so increase the cost to them of this aggression that they'll do a cost-benefit analysis and say, it's not worth it. We can't succeed in realizing our ambitions, so we're going to back off. And a lot of what we tried to do, we supplemented military aid to Ukraine with onerous economic sanctions and attempts to isolate Russia diplomatically and politically on the world stage. We tried to turn it into a pariah, hoping that these costs would cause the Russians to say, it's not worth it. We're either not going to invade or we're going to terminate this invasion. What I think, in fact, happened was it fueled threat perceptions in Russia. Because first and foremost, the Russians felt that they were dealing with a threat from NATO, that NATO was enlarging, it was approaching Russia's borders geographically, and it was also moving military capabilities onto Ukrainian territory that the Russians felt could potentially pose a real threat to Russian security. And the Russians weren't imagining this altogether. I would say that they were probably exaggerating to some degree the threat that they faced from NATO, but they didn't invent it out of whole cloth. We were, in fact, doing things with the Ukrainians that I think rational people would look at and say, that would, I think, cause concern. And so things that we thought were essentially defensive, attempting to deter the Russians, actually fueled Russian threat perceptions. And I think it put Putin in a situation where he worried that were he not to act, that the military relationship between the United States and Ukraine would become so extensive that a year or two down the road, he would have no option militarily to block what was becoming a de facto military alliance between the United States and Ukraine without actually going to war directly with the United States military. And he did not want to do that, still does not want to do that. I think he recognizes rightly that a direct clash with the United States military or a NATO military would escalate into a nuclear conflict, and everybody would be losers in that kind of situation. So he felt he faced sort of a now or never thing. If I don't do it now, then it will be inevitable that the United States or NATO will have significant military capabilities on Ukrainian soil a year or two down the road, and then we're in trouble. Now, this question of, are the Russians just going to keep rolling on if we don't defeat them in Ukraine, is also a question of looking at the actual military balance between NATO and Russia. It's not just attempting to glean Russian intentions. And when you look at the balance between Russia and NATO. The Russians are badly overmatched by NATO's combined military capabilities. NATO has many, many more men, much greater population. The combined militaries of the NATO allies are larger than Russia. The West has significant technological advantages over the Russians, particularly in air force and naval power. The Russians are essentially a ground power, but they have not traditionally been strong in aerospace or in naval forces. And I think the Russians are smart enough to recognize that getting into a conventional war with any one NATO member would put the overall NATO alliance in a position of having to go to war with Russia, having to exercise Article 5. Because if they did not, then the credibility of the alliance would probably be fatally compromised. And Washington knows that. Various NATO capitals understand that very well. If the Russians attack and we don't invoke Article 5, the alliance will not be long for this world, because the bonds of trust among its members would have been severed. So the Russians, do they have a military advantage over some individual NATO members? Yes, they do, particularly in the Baltic states. But the Russians don't believe that they could simply contain a war with one or more of the Baltic states and not see the rest of NATO come to their defense. The second thing that we do in the paper is we look at the experience in Ukraine and ask, why would the West believe, given the difficulties that the Russian military has had in subduing Ukraine, an opponent that Russia knows well? The Ukrainian military and the Russian military were both based on the Soviet military. A lot of the people that are fighting on both sides at the leadership level know each other. They went to the same schools, use the same equipment. So the Russians are fighting a familiar opponent. They know its strengths and weaknesses. They're doing it essentially on home turf. They know the Donbass region well. They know the terrain. Their supply lines are relatively short. So this is pretty much as easy a conquest, at least on paper, as you're going to get. And yet the Russians have struggled. They have not overwhelmed Ukraine, certainly not quickly. It's not been a David and Goliath kind of problem. They have not performed in a way that would give them any confidence that they could take on a NATO member with any great hope of success. So adding all this up, trying to understand what it was that drove the initial Russian invasion, looking at the balance of forces between NATO and Russia, and then looking at the performance of the Russian military so far in this war, I come to the very strong conclusion that the Russians are extremely unlikely to undertake premeditated aggression against a NATO state. In other words, this notion that unless we stop them in Ukraine, they're just going to keep rolling and pretty soon they're going to be in Paris, I think is absurd. Now, does that mean that the chances of war between the West and Russia are minimal? No, I don't think that's true, unfortunately. I wish it were true. Because of that initial framing that I talked to you about at the beginning. The chances of a World War II style premeditated aggression are small. But the chances that we could spiral into a direct conflict that neither side wants are actually quite significant. In other words, that World War I style escalation is a real problem. And that is why some of the headlines that we're seeing today about whether the Biden administration is going to green light the use of longer range missiles for strikes deep into Russian territory matter so much. Because we potentially have a situation where if the United States were to green light that sort of missile strike by the Ukrainians, the only way the Ukrainians could do that would be with the direct support of the United States for picking out targets in Russia and using our satellite or terrain mapping technology to make sure those missiles hit their targets. And the Russians know that. It's not a case of providing the Ukrainians with the capability and then they take over and do everything to use that system to strike into Russia. They would only be able to do that in partnership with the United States. And Putin understands that and has essentially drawn a line rhetorically and said, were the United States to okay this sort of strike by the Ukrainians, Russia would regard that as a direct act of war by the West against Russia. And he said Russia and the West would be in a state of war at that point, and Russia would have to take, quote unquote, appropriate decisions. Now, he has not said exactly what those decisions would be. He did, however, announce today that Russia was revising its nuclear use doctrine to provide for a contingency in which a non-nuclear power were to use conventional strikes to attack Russia in a massive way. And in those circumstances, if the partner of the non-nuclear state in launching these strikes were a nuclear power, that Russia could, under those circumstances, use nuclear weapons in response. Now, it's not very hard to read between the lines there. It's clear what Putin is describing. And without naming specific countries, he was depicting a scenario in which Ukraine, a non-nuclear power, partnered with the United States to strike deep into Russia. And he said those are the kinds of circumstances in which we would use nuclear weapons. Now, do I think they would if we were to do something like that? I rather doubt it. I think this rhetoric and the warning is designed to deter us, to cause us to think twice about the potential consequences of green lighting these sorts of missile strikes into Russia. That said, Putin has been so explicit about this in saying that Russia would respond that the Russians would have to do something. And I doubt that using nuclear weapons would be the first thing they would do. But I do believe that they would take some sort of direct retaliatory action against the United States or Britain. If Britain were to, for example, use the Storm Shadow air-launched cruise missiles, allow Ukraine to use those to strike deep into Russia. And that, in turn, could kick off a spiral of action and reaction that could get difficult to control. And each side's national pride would be at stake. And it would be very difficult for either side to back down under those sorts of pressurized circumstances. So it would be, I think, a very volatile and very dangerous situation. And that's one of the reasons why I have said, look, providing Ukraine with that kind of long-range missile strike capability is a very dangerous thing. It could lead to this escalatory spiral. And it's not going to change the fundamentals of the battlefield situation for the Ukrainians. So I think what we need to do today is bring diplomacy into this picture. You don't solve a World War I style escalatory problem without diplomacy. That's got to be a big part of it. And that's really been lacking so far. So that's where we ought to be. Not an easy problem to solve, very complicated, but the sooner we get down to trying to do that, the better off we'll all be, and the more of Ukraine there will be left to preserve, which I think is quite critical in all of this. So let me leave it at that, and we can go to questions.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that, George. If you have a question, please raise your hand, and I'll call on you. Let's see, my screen is a little off here. Okay. Good. Just before we get to questions, George, I just have to ask you, how do you see this thing ending? In other words, what would be the principles involved in a realistic scenario of a diplomatic solution?
Well, any diplomatic solution has to recognize that there are two dimensions to this conflict. One is bilateral between Russia and Ukraine. And that has to do with territory, where the border is drawn, has to do with treatments of ethnic minorities. It has to do with prisoners of war and reparations and things like that. But then the bigger context is between Russia and the West. And that's over the shape of Europe's security architecture, the relationship between Russia and NATO. In order to solve the war in Ukraine, you have to address both those aspects. Ukraine can't negotiate with Russia over the shape of Europe's security architecture. That's something that the United States and its NATO partners have to negotiate with Russia. And until we reach some understandings with Russia about NATO and about the military balance between Russia and NATO, conventionally and nuclearly, we're not going to solve the problem in Ukraine, because Russia needs to know that Ukraine is not going to be a military ally of the United States. It's not going to be a part of NATO. And if it can't get that kind of assurance through diplomatic means, its fallback, its plan B, is they're just going to wreck Ukraine. They're going to leave it in such a state of dysfunction that it's in no condition to ally with anybody. And that will be a tragedy. It will be a tragedy first and foremost for the people of Ukraine, but it will also be a long-term problem for Europe overall. Europe will be left with essentially an open wound that will be fraught with all kinds of problems that will radiate out of it for a long time to come. So the United States, I think, has to be talking directly to Russia about that bigger European security problem. And doing that, I think, will provide a context in which Ukraine and Russia can negotiate some understandings about their bilateral relationship. And that doesn't necessarily mean that Ukraine has to say, yeah, we agree that the land that you've conquered is now Russian. You can basically agree to disagree on that. A lot of wars end that way. You never formally recognize that the other side has a legitimate right to rule the territory that is conquered, but you nonetheless have a pragmatic way of dealing with one another going forward. That's what the United States did with the Soviet Union. We never recognized the incorporation of the Baltic states into the Soviet Union throughout the Cold War. Every map that the US government produced had a note on it saying the United States government does not recognize the incorporation of the Baltic states into the Soviet Union. But that, we didn't wage war with the Soviet Union to rectify that problem. We still dealt with them pragmatically. And I think that's probably how Ukraine and Russia are going to have to deal with the territorial issue.
Okay, well, thanks very much for that. Well, we have a bunch of questions lined up here. Let's go to Patricia Salisbury. Cole, could you unmute Patricia?
I do have a question, and I preface it very briefly. with a alternate view of what the essential dynamic is here, and then ask Professor Beebe what he thinks. I think you must take a much broader view than World War I, World War II models. We have a world now where the BRICS exist, where there's a tremendous drive to finally end colonialism. There's discussion now of an alternate financial architecture coming out of the BRICS meeting in Kazan. All of these things are a tremendous threat to the financier oligarchy, cutting off their looting avenues, creating an actual development dynamic in the world, which is anathema to these financiers. And I think that is the fundamental. They have an economic system that's essentially collapsing without unlimited looting to support it. So I think the fundamental dynamic is that from their standpoint, Russia, and we're also provoking China as much as we can, the key countries in the whole, that give the backbone to this alternate dynamic in the world. I think these things have to be understood to really understand what's going on and look for some solution to it. And I'd like to hear your views on that.
Well, I think you're absolutely right that the world order is in flux right now. And we are in the process of moving from what had been a unipolar world in the aftermath of the Cold War, where the United States was the unquestioned, unchallenged hegemon without any peer rivals, to a world in which we have many poles that are emerging over time. The United States is not going to be as dominant as it was in the post-Cold War period. And our stewardship of the world financial system is increasingly being challenged. And part of the reason why that's happening is many countries, and China and Russia are probably the loudest complainers here, but they're not by any means alone, regard the United States as having been a bad steward, that we have essentially taken advantage of our dominance of the world financial architecture and used it coercively against countries to punish those we don't like and reward those that we do. And we have exempted ourselves from the rules when we've seen fit to do that. And so, yes, part of this is Russia saying, we're not okay with that unipolar world. We want a greater voice in what the rules of the game in this international order ought to be. And we want the rules to apply to the United States and its allies just as much as those rules apply to us too. So that is part of the context of what's going on here. I would, however, argue that that's not the primary impetus for this particular war. It's something that is a factor, a larger contextual background against which the war is underway.
Okay, thank you, Professor. I would like you to join us at an IPC meeting, International Peace Coalition, tomorrow online to continue this very important discussion. And I'm putting some information in the chat so that you could do that if you're available. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Patricia. Let's go to Donald Smith.
Okay. Hello, Mr. Beebe. Some diplomats, including Chaz W. Freeman, Jack Matlock, Thomas Graham, and others, have acknowledged that the U.S. bears some responsibility in some form for the crisis by not respecting Russia's legitimate concerns, for example, sponsoring the coup, arming far-right militias. My question to you is, how many people in the foreign policy establishment secretly understand that? And how much success have you and your colleagues gotten in getting this message out? Do they think you are crazy Putin apologists, or do many people actually say, yeah, you're right, but I can't say it? Thanks.
Well, good question. I think if you look at the universe of Russia experts, it's probably more evenly divided on these issues than the broader popular discourse on the issue. In other words, you named a handful of people that I think understand well. I know all of them. I have a lot of respect for them. Tom Graham and I worked together in the White House back when we were it seems like a different world, trying to build a partnership between the United States and Russia. So, if you put a room full of 100 Russia experts together, maybe 50 or even 60 of them might tend toward my analysis of this. But when you look at broader popular discourse, mainstream media, for example, then, I would have to say we're a distinct minority. In part because the media play such a critical role in this narrative framing that I talked about. It's probably the most important thing that media do is not so much report on the facts, but establishing a cognitive framework for making sense of those facts. And once they've established that framework and it takes root, very difficult to challenge it. And so we find ourselves in a situation where, when we say, but, there are things that you're not taking account on, and you need to understand these other things, you immediately get labeled, Russian apologist, Putin apologist, you're an appeaser, et cetera, et cetera. And that's quite problematic, because if we're going to find our way out of this situation, we need to understand the complexities that are at work here. And we actually, I think, have got to have bipartisan cooperation on this issue. Donald Trump has said he's going to solve this, war in a day. That's completely absurd. It can't happen. It's far too difficult to find your way out of this very complicated mess in a short period of time. And moreover, because things are so partisan, it's almost guaranteed that the Democrats are going to say, no, you're surrendering to the Russians. You're a Russian apologist. We do not support any of all this. And I think the same thing would happen under Harris if she were to seek a diplomatic solution to this. It's almost guaranteed that the Republicans would accuse her of being weak, accusing the Biden administration of not providing the Ukrainians with everything that they needed to triumph, et cetera, greatly complicating a Harris administration's ability to find a way toward a solution in all of this. So regardless of who's president, I think we have to have some level of bipartisan cooperation. And I think we have to understand that we can differ in tactics, we can differ on some of the particulars in seeking a solution, but we need to have a realistic ambition, not of having Ukraine win this war unconditionally against Russia, because they can't, but aiming for a future in which Ukraine can join the European Union, can rebuild itself, can construct a viable polity that attracts the millions of refugees that have fled, and aspire toward a prosperous, secure future. That's still possible. We can still get there. And I think both the left and the right in America should be able to agree that that's something that we should all aim for. And then you get into a discussion about, okay, how do we do it? What do we do? And that's where reasonable people can differ. But we should be able to unite around a common goal on this.
Okay. Michael Hoey next.
So am I unmuted?
Yes.
Oh, good. Okay, so my question is about back channel diplomacy, and if it's likely that any kind of back channel diplomacy is going on that we don't know. And then also about the multipolar world. If we return to a planet based on spheres of influence and dominion, does that mean that a handful of super powerful countries with large militaries will get to beat up their neighbors?
Well, I would say no. It would not necessarily mean that a handful of regional hegemon would be able to have their way with their neighbors in a repressive way. There are different varieties of spheres of influence. There's a model in which you have essentially an oppressive relationship with your neighbors in your sphere of influence, one which is very intrusive on the internal politics of neighboring states. And then there's a model that is more defensive, that says, look, we don't care what goes on inside the states, essentially. They can choose whatever political system they see fit. That's their sovereign right. We do, however, reserve the right to say, you can't bring foreign military bases and capabilities onto your territory that threaten our own security. And just to pick an example from American history, the United States, of course, was quite exercised when the revolution in Cuba brought a communist regime to power. And John Kennedy decided, and I think he himself rued this decision in retrospect, but he decided that that was not okay for Cuba to be communist. And he tried to overthrow the Castro regime in the Bay of Pigs operation through a CIA covert action. And it failed miserably. And I think JFK decided that that was probably the biggest mistake he had made in his presidency, and came to the opinion that the United States should not be dictating to its neighbors what their particular internal political arrangement ought to be. But he did say it is not okay for Cuba to have nuclear missiles based on its territory that could threaten the security of the United States and the American people. And so I think the Russians, when it comes to Ukraine, have essentially said, we're not comfortable with Ukraine bringing foreign military capabilities onto its territory that threaten Russia. And we have to find a way to prevent that. We can either prevent it through diplomatic understandings or through military force. And unfortunately, the United States refused to discuss this diplomatically with the Russians, and the Russians chose force.
Okay, thanks. Thank you, George. Let's go to John Hallam next.
Well, I guess two points that are kind of interrelated. One is that for decades, I've had a fascination, almost an obsession with World War One. And it does seem to me that while the Ukraine-Russia conflict contains elements of a World War One style conflict, it unfortunately looks to me much more like a World War II style conflict. That said, I think I agree with Professor Beebe that the role of a negotiated solution, and I have written numerous letters to both Zelensky and Putin urging a negotiated solution, is absolutely critical, that there is enough of World War One elements in it that diplomacy might still work, and that diplomacy has not, on the whole, been given enough of an opportunity to work, and that therefore a ceasefire followed by negotiations very much along the lines that you're suggesting might well be the way to go. But I have to admit that my sympathy for Vladimir is absolutely zero. And that is based on continual exposure. I do also do a daily Ukraine update, and that's based on continual exposure to what he says, and that what he says is indeed scary. Pray comment. I realize this is not much of a question, but I think all of the points that I've made do invite a response from you.
Well, I don't want to get into a detailed debate over the degree to which this overlaps with World War II. I think we both agree that there are elements of both here. And the relative mix is something that people can debate. And I think we both come down to the same place here, that diplomacy has a critical role in finding our way forward in all of this. And I would also agree that there are very few Americans that have any sympathy for Vladimir Putin and what he and Russia have done in all of this. I think there are a lot of people that sympathize with the plight of the Ukrainians in all of this, and believe that they deserve support in their own self-defense. What I would say, though, is that they deserve more than just military support, more than just economic support. They deserve diplomatic support.
Yes.
If we don't provide that, unfortunately, what's going to happen is Ukraine will simply collapse over time. The Russians are just wearing them down. They're exhausting Ukraine's reserves of manpower. They're decimating Ukraine's infrastructure, its power grid, its power generation capabilities. And Ukraine can't keep this war up indefinitely. It will reach a breaking point. No one can know exactly when that breaking point will be reached, but it's not going to be 10 years from now, I don't believe. It's going to be a lot sooner than that. And once Ukraine breaks, it's going to be hard to pick up the pieces. Much harder to pick up the pieces of a broken Ukraine than it will be to negotiate a compromise settlement now, while Ukraine is still in a condition to get back on its feet.
Yes, I think we're in thunderous agreement on the necessity of a compromise solution.
Okay, thank you. Let's go to David Ross-Gerling.
Yeah, can you hear me, guys?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, very briefly. Over the past 2 years, I've been participating in discussions on Ukraine, and most of them have been great. But it seems to me that there's sort of like a censorship of a discussion of the Monroe Doctrine, something that every grade school child from my generation knew about. Unfortunately, only on the far right, Tucker Carlson, the far left, Code Pink, ever bring up a discussion of, if the Russians or the Chinese put a military base on the Canadian border with New York State, we'd probably have an all-out war, just like what's happening now with Ukraine and NATO, putting military on the frontier of Russia. Why is it so difficult to mention the Monroe Doctrine? Is it not valuable anymore? That's my question.
Well, I've noticed the same thing. You're not imagining that. And I think there are a couple of reasons for this. One is, I think people are loath to suggest that there might be any justification for what the Russians have done. They don't want in any way to suggest they might have a rational excuse for this aggression. And as a result, they're loath to suggest there is any equivalence between the Monroe Doctrine and what the Russians have been doing in Ukraine. That's number one. Number two, we're the good guys, right? We look at this from the perspective of the United States being a force for good in the world, and the Russians are not. And so things that we do essentially are okay. Things that they do are questionable at best. And so the discussion that you're talking about, while it makes rational sense, presumes that we could have some kind of empathy for the Russians, meaning not sympathy, not feeling like they're right and justified, but some ability to walk in their shoes and see things from their perspective. That's a hard thing to do. I think it's actually a critical ingredient in sound foreign policy analysis. But there's very little of that empathy going on in the United States, at least in our popular discourse.
Okay, thank you, David. Let's go on to Miles Flagg.
Hello, Mr. Beebe. Hello from Canada. Two quick questions. One, how does anyone, so in this case Russia, know that a missile flying at them doesn't have, say, 100 kiloton nuclear warhead on it? And or anyone, how does the USA not know that a missile sent their ways isn't nuclear tipped? And then the second question is, if President Biden, 2 years ago said this man must be stopped, well, why did the US and all NATO countries, such as Canada, not invoke their War Measures Act to turn into a war economy, get conscription, get steel plants making ammunition and all this and that? So there's a hypocrisy, or there's gross negligence if they can talk about how this is such a threat to the rest of the world that we haven't 2 years ago invoked War Measures Act. So 2 questions, thanks.
Yeah, both very, very good questions. On the first one, I will simply say there are things that countries can do with their intelligence apparatus to try to ascertain whether incoming missile strikes are nuclear tipped or not. That said, if we were to authorize longer range strikes by the Ukrainians using American missiles, we would be putting a lot of burden on the Russians to be confident that their intelligence would not pick up some sort of surreptitious nuclear arming of these missiles. Now, the models that we're talking about providing are not equipped with nuclear warheads. They're not designed to use nuclear warheads. But the Russians don't trust us. We, of course, say to ourselves, well, of course, we would never do that. Why would we give the Ukrainians nuclear weapons? That would be ridiculous. But the Russians have very, very little trust for the United States in all of this. So that's part of the reason why I think this is all very risky, because there is such low trust. And the Russians have very little time to make these judgments about what's coming their way. Now, the second question that you asked, I think, is a great question. I think it speaks to a major gap between our rhetoric and our behavior. We have said as an official US government policy since 2008 at the Bucharest summit of the NATO alliance that Ukraine would one day be a member of the NATO alliance. We've reiterated that over and over again, most recently just a few weeks ago at the NATO 75th anniversary summit in Washington. Now, one would think logically that if we believe Ukraine should be a member of the NATO alliance, that means that the United States believes it is in our country's vital interest to go to war to defend Ukraine. Because bringing Ukraine into a military alliance with the United States would also include an Article 5 commitment that if Ukraine is attacked, the United States and other NATO members will consider that an attack on them as well. But we obviously don't believe that an attack on Ukraine is an attack on us. When Russia annexed the Crimean Peninsula from Ukraine in 2014, the United States did not go to war to counter that move by the Russians, nor did we go to war in 2022 when the Russians launched this full-scale invasion of Ukraine. So our actions suggest that we don't believe that Ukraine's defense is in our vital interest, that it's something we have to go to war, should go to war to prevent. And yet we still, as a point of rhetoric, argue that Ukraine should be part of the alliance. How do you reconcile that? I don't think you can. I mean, the only way you can reconcile it is to suppose that we believe that Article 5 commitment is some sort of magic talisman, that if you simply have it on paper, that Russia wouldn't dare attack anyone and you'd never have to invoke it, which I think is an extraordinarily dangerous basis for committing the United States to a treaty alliance. So we've got to reconcile that contradiction. And very few people are willing to acknowledge that there is that gap between our official rhetoric and what our behavior actually tells you about what we truly believe.
Right. Okay. We still have a lot of questions lined up here. We're not going to probably get to them all, but George, can you go till 8:15 or is that too much?
Yeah, I can do that.
Okay. So let's go to Nelson Casfer.
It's really an immediate follow-up to your comments just now. Looking at a specific diplomatic solution, would the United States accept an Austrian solution, that is, neutralizing Ukraine, not having it part of NATO? Could we step back that way? Or do you really think the United States sees the war in Ukraine as a way to reduce the strength of Russia militarily to the advantage of the United States? So that would make it impossible. And secondly, or part of that is, would a neutralized, do you think it would be possible to have a neutral solution in which part of the territory, Crimea in particular, remained in Russian control?
Well, excellent question. And in fact, prior to this invasion, I proposed an Austrian state treaty type solution for Ukraine. I thought that was the best way to avoid a conflict. Unfortunately, the Biden administration did not take that path. And I think it's going to be harder now for that kind of an approach to work. Not impossible. The Austrian state treaty was actually a treaty. It was signed by the United States, by the Soviet Union, by Austria itself, by the French and German allied powers, all of whom were co-occupying Austrian territory in the aftermath of World War II. And we all agreed Austria is not going to be a part of any alliance, neither NATO nor the Warsaw Pact. It would be a neutral state. And that treaty was ratified by the US Senate, as all treaties are required under our Constitution. So part of the question that you're asking here is, would the United States Senate ratify a treaty of neutrality that the United States was a party to in Ukraine? And my answer to that is almost certainly not. Our domestic politics are such that I don't think that kind of treaty would stand Senate scrutiny. I think it's a pity that it wouldn't, but I don't think it would. So that leaves the question of if Ukrainian neutrality is a necessary ingredient to ending this war, how do you work that? One possibility is, the Ukrainians go back to their original post-Soviet constitution from 1992, in which they, as a constitutional matter, committed themselves to official neutrality. They changed that law. Their constitution now says that they are going to seek NATO membership, part of the reason why the Russians are unhappy. So the Ukrainians themselves could go back to that constitutional provision that they had for much of their post-Soviet history. That will be a part of it. But I think the Russians want more than that, because Ukraine obviously changed that provision, and the Russians want more assurance that this will be a durable agreement. So they want a commitment from the United States and NATO on our part saying we're not going to do this. Now, how do you do that if you can't get the Senate to ratify a treaty? I think you have to get creative. And one of the things that could happen is there could be a peace settlement that the Ukrainians and Russians sign that then goes to the UN Security Council for blessing. And if the UN Security Council votes to approve it, and Russia would have to be a part of that, the United States and China would have to be a part of that, or this wouldn't pass. But if they were to approve it, then that agreement has the force of law internationally. And it's possible that we could have a situation where Russia could be satisfied with a settlement that is ratified by the UN Security Council, has the force of law, binds the United States and other NATO members as a result, and also is embedded in some sort of constitutional provision in Ukraine itself. I think that might be doable.
Okay, interesting. Okay, let's go to Joseph Gerson.
So, George, let me first just appreciate your perseverance and your rationality and your patience. It's all exemplary and deeply appreciated. My sense is that, going back to one of your earlier assertions, which I agree with, is that unless Ukraine breaks, this war is not going to end unless there's a meeting of the minds in some way between the U.S., to a lesser extent, NATO, and Russia. And we're in a situation, as you said, where the European security architecture has been absolutely shattered. And I'm involved in conversations with Russians, Europeans, and Americans, and you hear this all the time. My question is just trying to drill down, because there's very little discussion about this, is what do you envision as possible alternative structures, ones that might provide a foundation for at least coexistence well into the 21st century?
Well, I think we have some examples from the Cold War period that aren't perfect, but could be modified to adjust to present day conditions and put in place some sort of broader order in Europe. What the Russians want, I think, is at this point a much greater European role in European security. I think they believe that NATO enlargement is threatening for two big reasons. One is that it's moving closer and closer to Russia's own borders. But the second is that it's so dominated by the United States that NATO has become America's cat's paw, at least from Russia's point of view. I think the Russians would be far more comfortable if NATO's military leadership were actually European to a much greater degree than it has been. The Supreme Allied Commander position, which is a military position, has always been an American. It's always been an American military official. The Europeans have had the NATO Secretary General position, which is essentially a political position. I think the Russians would like to see Europeans being Supreme Allied Commander. It would make them feel a lot more comfortable than what has been the case. And frankly, I think it's in America's own interest for that to happen. I think Europe is going to have to be a lot more autonomous, a lot more self-sufficient. As the world becomes more multipolar, we need Europe to be one of those poles, not a subordinate to the United States. Not a chorus that echoes what Washington is telling them to sing, but actually able to be a balancing pole within a multipolar order so that there's a rough balance among the world's leading powers, China, India, Russia, the United States, and Europe. And if Europe doesn't play that role, it's going to be harder for us to establish a balance in the world as a result. So that's part of what the Russians want. They also want conventional arms control. We used to have what's called the Conventional Forces in Europe Treaty that provided a balance among the conventional forces of the European states. There were ceilings that each country had on its military holdings. There were notification requirements for exercises and troop movements. There were confidence and security building measures that would help assure all of the players in Europe that what was going on was transparent and not threatening. And we had nuclear arms control, and the most important European nuclear treaty was the Treaty on Intermediate Forces in Europe that banned an entire class of intermediate range missiles. And the CFE treaty is gone. The INF treaty is gone. And as a result, Europe is falling into a renuclearization period. The United States just announced a few weeks ago that it was going to be basing missiles on German territory that would have been banned under the INF treaty. And the Russians are going to do the same thing. They have to. Their military is not strong enough conventionally to counterbalance all of NATO. So they're going to have to rely more and more on the nuclear forces. That puts European security on a hair trigger. The warning times that countries have for detecting missile launches and making decisions about whether to launch in response are measured in 5, 6, 7 minutes. Now, that's a terrible situation for Europe and the world to be in. So the architecture that we have to aim towards, I think, carves out a role for neutral states. It says that there has to be a role for neutrality in Europe, something that the United States and NATO have not been willing to accept. It means a return to conventional arms control. It means a return to nuclear arms control. And it means that Europe is going to have a much bigger autonomous voice in its own defense and security. And I think NATO is going to have to return to its original mission, which was self-defense. It was defending members against attack. It was not going out of area into the Balkans, into other states, into Asia, trying to, proselytize, spread the gospel of liberal governance, as NATO has done. And I think the Russians have been very uncomfortable with that. So I think those are the basic principles that will have to shape where we go.
If I could just,
Thank you for those.
if I just say, Paul,
Right,
there's a massive demonstration planned in Germany on October the 3rd, targeted against those missiles. And George, I look forward to more conversation because there are questions about the degree to which Europe it can be unified and operate as a unified system, and questions about what Germany is going to become.
Yep.
Okay, thanks, Judge. Just before taking the next and perhaps last question from Jeffrey, Jeffrey, just be ready 1 second. I want to encourage everyone who feels that this Ukraine situation is a real crisis that we all must deal with, to get involved with us here at Mass Peace Action in our Ukraine campaign. It's called Ukraine, A Time for Peace. It attempts to unite people of different perspectives on the background and a lot of other pieces about the Ukraine war around the idea that whatever our differences are, the time is now for negotiations and a ceasefire and a diplomatic settlement. That the situation both for Ukraine and for the world, as well as for Russia, is just too dangerous right now to ignore that. So please get involved with us. I'm just putting the link to the form that you can fill out if you want to get involved with us with that campaign. And now let us go to Jeffrey Bachtel. Jeffrey, you got a question?
It's Barkdull. Yes. But before I could do, Paul, we really need to work on this trust issue, because I feel like I'm being purposely skipped in these question sessions. But anyway, George, I know from history, this what that you gotta go to the root of the problem in order to come up with a long-term solution. Because I know from fact that a deal was made between Reagan and Gorbachev that allowed Germany to reunify under the condition that NATO doesn't expand west. What was that treaty called again? First off, and secondly, I know that America went against that treaty, whatever that treaty was called, thanks to Bill Clinton by expanding eastward. Is that correct? First, second, and thirdly, how do you propose we can fix all this damage that we've done? If we did fix all this damage that we've done to Russia because of what we've done, if all is true, you know what I mean, right?
Well, so on the question of NATO, that's a very controversial subject among historians. What happened was when the Berlin Wall fell, the Warsaw Pact dissolved, one of the questions that immediately arose was the question of German reunification. And in order for Germany to reunify under the terms of the post-World War II arrangements, the four powers that had occupied Germany all had to agree legally that Germany could reunify, and that meant that the Soviets had a say in all of this. So as a part of the discussions about German reunification, the Secretary of State at the time, not under Reagan, but under George H.W. Bush, was James Baker. And he met with his Soviet counterpart, Foreign Minister Edward Shevardnadze, and with then Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev. And Gorbachev and Shevardnadze said, look, we are comfortable approving German reunification, but not if NATO is going to move on to East German territory. And so we discussed with the Soviets at the time an understanding that Germany would reunify and that Germany would become a part of NATO, but that the former East German part of this reunited Germany would never host NATO forces. And in the course of those discussions, James Baker made a verbal pledge to the Soviet leaders saying that NATO would not move 1 inch to the east. Now, that was never formally put into treaty form. It was never actually written down as a politically binding agreement. And so those people that say, the United States never actually formally pledged that NATO wouldn't move eastward, claim that this had no binding effect on U.S. actions going into the future. And historians are debating this question to this day. Now, the other thing that they argue is this only had to do with East Germany. That nobody at the time was talking about Poland or Hungary or the Czech Republic or anything like that. And to this day, the German government has never moved NATO forces onto East German territory. They consider that a binding pledge on their part. Now, I think it's a little disingenuous to imagine that the Soviets would care immensely about whether East Germany was part of NATO and not about whether Poland or Hungary or any of these other states were part of this. So to some degree, those that make the argument that this only had to do with Germany and not any place to the east of this, I think are being a little disingenuous in all of this. But this is a real debate among historians.
Okay, well, thank you
Well-
so much, George.
Well, after all, you know, if it, can I
Jeffrey,
just-
hold on a second, Jeffrey. I'm going to, Sarah Selden has been waiting for a long time to ask a question. Let's let Sarah ask the last question.
Oh, thank you very much. I've been hearing a lot of wisdom here. And I think that your efforts to calm people down and stop these crazy ideas that keep bursting to the surface and should never be done. And you're doing a great job. So however I can help you, I will help you. I've fought for world peace most of my long life. And I absolutely approve of what you're doing here. And I'll be back next time. Okay?
Okay, thanks, Sarah.
Great
Thank
to
you.
see you all.
Great. Thanks very much, Sarah. So thanks to everyone, George, especially you, for all these interesting angles and insights into such a tragic situation. And I think for whatever differences we have, we can see the need for a negotiated settlement to end this war. And anything we can do to promote that and to avoid moving toward a war between NATO and Russia is absolutely needed right now. So, George, we're looking forward to new things that you'll be writing. And thanks very much. And thanks everyone for joining us this evening. We will be sending out a link to a YouTube recording of tonight's event, as well as a few other links to articles and things like that. So keep an eye out for that. You might want to share that with other people that didn't get a chance to be on the webinar tonight. If you think that they would benefit from it, please send them that link. Good night, everybody. Thank you, George.
Thank you.